I stood in my kitchen at 4 a.m, suitcase packed and Uber waiting outside. The guest list for 20 people lay crumpled on the counter next to my mother-in-law's handwritten note. Start cooking at 5 a.m, Annette. Make sure everything is perfect this time. My husband Marcus had nodded in agreement yesterday, adding his own demands about the menu. They expected me to spend 18 hours alone preparing a feast while they watched football. Instead, I was about to catch a 6 a.m. flight to Miami. Let them explain the empty kitchen to 30 hungry relatives. 2 days earlier, I was folding laundry in our bedroom when Dorothy's silver Mercedes pulled into our driveway without warning. Through the window, I watched my mother-in-law emerge wearing her signature pearls and that expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad day, that someone was always me. Marcus rushed to greet her at the door, his voice taking on that childlike tone he only used with his mother. I descended the stairs slowly, already bracing myself for whatever fresh torment she'd devised. "Annette, dear," Dorothy said, though the endearment dripped with condescension. She pulled a folded paper from her designer handbag and placed it on our dining table with the ceremony of someone presenting a legal document. I finalized the guest list for Thanksgiving. I unfolded the paper and felt my stomach drop. 23 names were written in Dorothy's precise script, including people I'd never heard of and several relatives who lived 3 states away. 23 people, I managed to say. "Oh, I've added a few more since then," Dorothy waved dismissively. "Should be closer to 30 by Thursday. Nothing you can't handle, surely." Marcus appeared at my shoulder, scanning the list without a hint of concern. "Looks great, Mom. Annette loves hosting big gatherings." That was news to me. Last year I'd cooked for 12 people while Marcus and his father spent the day watching games in the living room. The year before that it was 8 people, and I'd naively thought that was overwhelming. Now I understood Dorothy's strategy. Each year she increased the burden while decreasing the help. "I've written out the menu and timeline." Dorothy continued producing another paper. "You'll need to start the turkey preparation at 5 a.m. sharp. The sides should be rotating in and out of the oven every 30 minutes. I've included cooking temperatures and timing charts." I stared at the elaborate schedule that mapped out every minute from 5 in the morning until dinner was served at 4 p.m. 11 straight hours of cooking with no breaks and no assistance. "Mom's friends from the country club are coming," Marcus added as if this explained everything. "Don't embarrass us, Annette." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Don't embarrass us. As if my previous efforts hadn't been good enough, as if I hadn't worked myself to exhaustion trying to meet Dorothy's impossible standards. Last year's stuffing was adequate at best, Dorothy said, consulting her notes. Too much sage, not enough structure, and the gravy was thin. I've written specific instructions this time. Follow them exactly. I remembered last year's gravy. I'd stirred it for 40 minutes, tasting and adjusting until it was silky and rich. Dorothy had taken one bite and announced to the table that it needed work. Marcus had agreed immediately. "There's one more thing," Dorothy said, her smile becoming sharper. "I've invited Sarah and her family. You remember Sarah, don't you?" Of course I remembered Sarah. Marcus's college girlfriend, the one Dorothy constantly mentioned as an example of proper breeding and domestic skills. The one who supposedly made the most amazing pecan pie and never left dishes in the sink. "Sarah understands our family traditions," Marcus said, avoiding my eyes. "It'll be nice to catch up." I felt something crack inside my chest. This wasn't about Thanksgiving dinner. This was about putting me in my place, demonstrating that I would never measure up to Dorothy's standards or her vision of the perfect daughter-in-law. Sarah's presence would be the final humiliation, a living reminder of who Marcus could have married instead. "I'll leave these with you," Dorothy said, gathering her purse. "Study them carefully, And Annette, dear, do try to wear something presentable while you're cooking. First impressions matter. After she left, I turned to Marcus, hoping for some acknowledgement of how unreasonable this was. Instead, he was already heading toward the living room. "Marcus," I said, "this is insane. 30 people by myself?" He paused at the doorway. "Mom's put a lot of thought into this, Annette. She's trying to help you become a better hostess. Help me, she's setting me up to fail." "You're being dramatic," he said. "Just follow her instructions and everything will be fine. Maybe you'll actually learn something." That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Marcus snored beside me. I thought about the woman I used to be before I married into this family. I'd had confidence opinions friends. When had I become this anxious person who jumped at Dorothy's commands and accepted Marcus's dismissive comments as normal? The answer was gradual and systematic. 3 years of criticism disguised as helpful suggestions. 3 years of being excluded from family decisions while being held responsible for their execution. 3 years of watching Marcus choose his mother's approval over his wife's well-being. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow I would show them exactly what happened when they pushed too far. The next morning I woke to the sound of Dorothy's voice echoing from the kitchen. She'd let herself in again, something that had become disturbingly common since Marcus gave her our spare key without consulting me. "Regina, you have to understand what I'm dealing with here," Dorothy was saying into her phone. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened, my heart pounding. Annette simply doesn't know how to manage a proper household. Yesterday I found expired yogurt in their refrigerator. Expired. And don't get me started on the dust on the ceiling fans. I gripped the banister, realizing she was talking to Marcus's aunt, a woman I'd always thought liked me. "Marcus is too kind to say anything, but he's embarrassed. The boy deserves better than someone who can't even keep a clean house. Honestly, Regina, he's lucky he married her at all. Most men wouldn't settle for so little." The word settle hit me like a slap. I'd heard Dorothy use it before, but never so explicitly. In her mind, Marcus had lowered his standards to marry me, and I should be grateful for his sacrifice. "I've been documenting things," Dorothy continued. "Taking pictures when they're not looking. Someone needs to help Marcus see what he's dealing with." Pictures. She'd been photographing evidence of my inadequacy. I thought about all the times she'd visited, how she'd wandered through our house with her phone, claiming to admire our decorating choices. Marcus's footsteps came up behind me. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "Listening to your mother destroy my reputation to your family," I whispered back. He frowned and moved closer to hear. Dorothy was still talking. "The Thanksgiving dinner will be the final test. If she can't handle a proper family gathering, Marcus will have to face reality about his marriage." I looked at Marcus, waiting for outrage, for protective anger on my behalf. Instead, his face showed only mild discomfort. "She's just worried about you," he said quietly. "She wants you to succeed." "She's taking pictures of dust, Marcus. She's building a case against me to our entire family." "Don't be paranoid, Annette. Mom notices things because she cares about standards." The phone conversation ended and Dorothy's heels clicked across our kitchen floor. Marcus headed downstairs to greet her while I remained frozen on the landing, processing what I'd heard. Later that afternoon, Dorothy insisted on accompanying me to the grocery store for Thanksgiving shopping. What should have been a simple errand became a public humiliation. She questioned every item I selected loudly enough for other shoppers to hear. "Are you sure about that brand of cranberry sauce, dear? I've always found it too tart." She plucked the can from my cart and replaced it with a more expensive alternative. "The turkey needs to be organic and free-range," she announced to the butcher, though I'd already selected a perfectly good bird. My daughter-in-law is still learning about quality ingredients. The butcher gave me a sympathetic look that made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. I wanted to explain that I wasn't some helpless novice, that I'd been cooking successfully for years before Dorothy decided to micromanage my every decision. At the produce section, she rejected my choices of vegetables with increasingly dramatic sighs. "These carrots are too small. These potatoes have eyes. Honestly, Annette, how do you normally shop?" Other customers began to stare. A woman with her teenage daughter looked at me with undisguised pity. I realized this was exactly what Dorothy wanted to demonstrate my incompetence in front of witnesses. The final straw came when she selected the most expensive and difficult items she could find. Specialty cheeses that needed precise timing, exotic vegetables that required techniques I'd never learned, a dessert wine that cost more than our usual grocery budget for an entire week. "Marcus's tastes have become more sophisticated since college," she said loud enough for the cashier to hear. "I'm trying to help elevate his home environment." Back at the house, Dorothy proceeded to rearrange my entire kitchen. She moved my spices to different cabinets, reorganized my pots and pans, and relocated my cooking utensils to drawers that made no sense. "This is much more efficient," she declared, though I could barely find anything anymore. Professional kitchens are organized logically. Marcus arrived home from work to find his mother knee-deep in kitchen renovation and his wife standing helplessly in the chaos. "Wow, Mom, this looks amazing," he said, surveying the disruption. "You really know how to optimize a space." "I'm trying to set Annette up for success on Thursday," Dorothy replied. "Though honestly, Marcus, I worry about her organizational skills." That evening, after Dorothy finally left, I attempted to address the situation with Marcus directly. "Your mother is sabotaging me," I said as we got ready for bed. "She's making this impossible on purpose." "That's ridiculous, Annette. She spent all day helping you prepare." "She spent all day undermining my confidence and confusing my kitchen." Marcus sat on the edge of our bed, loosening his tie with the weary expression of a man being asked to referee a conflict he found tedious. "Look, I know Mom can be particular, but she knows what she's doing. Maybe if you listened to her advice instead of fighting it, you'd learn something." "I'm not fighting her advice, Marcus. I'm trying to maintain some dignity while she systematically destroys my self-confidence." "You're being dramatic again," he said, using the same dismissive tone Dorothy employed. "Mom's family has been hosting elegant gatherings for generations. You should be grateful she's willing to share that knowledge." "What if I don't want to host elegant gatherings? What if I just want to cook a nice meal for our family without being criticized and monitored like a suspect?" Marcus turned to face me fully, and for a moment I thought he might actually hear me. Instead, his expression hardened. "If you can't handle basic family responsibilities, what does that say about our marriage? Mom's friends will be there, Annette. Sarah will be there. I need to know you can represent our family appropriately." The conversation ended there with Marcus turning away and me staring at the ceiling again, wondering when I'd become so small in my own life. But this time, instead of feeling defeated, I felt something else stirring. Something that felt dangerously like rebellion. Dorothy had made one crucial mistake in her campaign against me. She'd underestimated what happens when a person has nothing left to lose. Unable to sleep, I crept downstairs to make tea and found myself standing in Dorothy's reorganized kitchen, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Every opened cabinet revealed my belongings relocated according to someone else's logic. Even my favorite coffee mug had been banished to a high shelf I could barely reach. As I waited for the water to boil, I noticed a cardboard box tucked behind the kitchen island. Dorothy had left it there after her organizational frenzy. Curious, I opened it and found old photo albums and loose pictures dating back decades. The photos told a story I'd never heard before. There was Dorothy as a young bride, maybe 25 years old, standing stiffly beside Marcus's father in their first apartment. But it was the photos from family gatherings that caught my attention. In picture after picture, Dorothy looked miserable during holiday celebrations. One photo showed her in a kitchen flower in her hair and stress written across her face while an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes stood behind her pointing at something with obvious disapproval. The woman was Eleanor Marcus's paternal grandmother, someone I'd only heard mentioned in hushed, reverent tones. I dug deeper and found letters written in Eleanor's precise handwriting. The tea kettle whistled, but I ignored it, transfixed by what I was reading. Dorothy must learn to manage a household properly if she expects to remain in this family. Her casserole tonight was under-seasoned, and her table settings were informal to the point of embarrassment. I've prepared detailed instructions for improvement. Another letter was even more cutting. I've spoken with several women at the club about Dorothy's housekeeping standards. The consensus is that Marcus could have done better. However, since he's made his choice, we must work with what we have. Letter after letter detailed Eleanor's systematic criticism of Dorothy. Her cooking, her cleaning, her hostessing skills, even her choice of clothing and hairstyles. The young woman in the photos had endured exactly what Dorothy was putting me through now. At the bottom of the box, I found Dorothy's own handwriting on a piece of yellowed paper. No daughter-in-law of mine will have it easy. If I had to earn my place in this family, so will she. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Dorothy wasn't just being cruel for the sake of cruelty. She was perpetuating a cycle, passing down the abuse she'd received to the next generation. In her mind, suffering was the price of admission to the family, and exempting me would somehow invalidate her own painful experience. But understanding her motivation didn't make her behavior acceptable. If anything, it made me more determined to break the pattern. I wouldn't spend the next 20 years becoming the kind of person who tortured some future daughter-in-law because I'd been tortured myself. I opened my laptop and began researching flights to Miami. My sister Claire had been begging me to visit for 2 years, but Marcus always found reasons why the timing wasn't right. It was too expensive, or he had work commitments, or his family had plans I couldn't miss. The 6 a.m. flight would get me to Miami by 9:30. I could be on the beach while Dorothy and Marcus tried to explain my absence to 30 hungry relatives. The thought filled me with giddy anticipation. I booked the ticket using my personal credit card, the one I'd kept from before my marriage, despite Marcus's suggestions that we consolidate our finances completely. Some instinct had warned me to maintain that small measure of independence, and now I was grateful for my caution. Next, I withdrew $300 from my personal account at an ATM, enough for transportation and unexpected expenses. I packed strategically, taking important documents, sentimental jewelry, and my work laptop. Nothing that would immediately alert Marcus to my plans, but everything I'd need if my absence stretched longer than a few days. I wrote a detailed email explaining my decision, scheduled to send at 6 a.m. when I'd already be in the air. The email laid out 3 years of escalating psychological abuse, documented with specific examples and dates. I attached photos of Dorothy's reorganized kitchen and copies of her cruel notes about my inadequacies. I refuse to spend 18 hours cooking for people who treat me like hired help, I wrote. When you're ready to discuss genuine changes to our family dynamics, I'll consider returning. Until then, you can order pizza and explain to your guests why respect matters more than appearances. I called Claire from the bathroom with the shower running to muffle my voice. I need to make an emergency visit, I whispered. Can you pick me up at Miami International tomorrow morning? Of course, Claire said immediately. What's wrong? Is everything okay? I'll explain when I see you, but Claire, I'm finally standing up for myself. It's about time, she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. I've been waiting 3 years for this phone call. As I finalized my escape plans, I found myself looking at our wedding photos on the mantle. Marcus and I looked so happy, so full of hope for our future together. When had that optimistic couple become two people who could barely communicate without conflict? The answer was gradual erosion. One dismissed concern at a time. One-sided family argument at a time. One instance of Marcus choosing his mother's approval over his wife's feelings at a time. But it didn't have to continue. Change was possible if people were willing to do the work. The question was whether Marcus would choose growth or comfort when faced with the consequences of his choices. I set my alarm for 3 a.m. and tried to sleep, but excitement and anxiety kept me awake. In a few hours, I would either save my marriage or end it, but either outcome had to be better than the slow suffocation I'd been accepting as normal. For the first time in 3 years, I was taking control of my own life. Whatever happened next, I would face it as the strong, confident woman I used to be, not the anxious shell I'd allowed myself to become. My phone alarm buzzed at 3 a.m., but I was already awake staring at the ceiling and listening to Marcus's steady breathing beside me. I slipped out of bed with the practiced stealth of someone who'd learned to move quietly around a sleeping household. The house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, like it belonged to someone else. I suppose in many ways it did. This had never really been my home, just a place where I was allowed to exist, as long as I followed Dorothy's rules and Marcus's expectations. My suitcase waited in the front closet where I'd hidden it behind winter coats. The Uber driver texted that he was 2 minutes away, and I felt my heart rate spike with nervous energy. There was no going back after this. Whatever consequences awaited me, I was committed to seeing them through. I took one last look around the kitchen Dorothy had reorganized at the impossible timeline taped to the refrigerator at the guest list that had started this whole rebellion. Then I walked out the front door and didn't look back. The airport was surprisingly busy for 4 a.m., filled with people catching early flights or finishing red-eye journeys. I felt invisible among the travelers, just another passenger heading somewhere important. Nobody knew I was running away from my own life. Security moved quickly, and I was at my gate by 5:15. As I waited to board, I composed a text to my boss explaining that I was taking an emergency personal day. Sarah, my supervisor, had always been understanding about work-life balance. She'd probably have opinions about my dramatic exit strategy, but she'd cover for me professionally. The flight attendant called for boarding, and I walked onto the plane feeling lighter than I had in months. No cooking timeline to follow, no critical in-laws to please, no husband questioning my every decision. Just 3 hours of peaceful flight time before I landed in my sister's world. At exactly 7 a.m., my phone started buzzing with incoming messages. The automated email had sent, and Marcus was discovering my absence. I turned off my phone without reading the messages and settled into my window seat, watching the sunrise paint the clouds pink and gold. Meanwhile, according to the doorbell camera footage I would see later, chaos was erupting at home. Marcus woke at 7:15 to use the bathroom and noticed my empty side of the bed. He called my name, assuming I'd started early on Dorothy's impossible cooking schedule. When he reached the kitchen and found it empty, he began calling my phone. Dorothy arrived at 7:30, letting herself in with her key and expecting to find me elbow-deep in turkey preparation. Instead, she found Marcus standing in the kitchen reading my email on his phone, his face pale with shock. "She left," he said, holding up the phone like evidence of an impossible crime. "Annette actually left." Dorothy snatched the phone and read my message, her expression cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been panic. The email laid out her systematic campaign of criticism in clinical detail, complete with quotes from her conversations with family members and descriptions of her kitchen reorganization tactics. "This is preposterous," Dorothy declared, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "She's having some sort of breakdown. Mental instability runs in families, you know." Marcus wasn't listening. He was staring at the empty kitchen, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd expected me to accomplish alone. 11 hours of cooking for 30 people without help or breaks. When had that started seeming reasonable to him? At 8 a.m., his cousin David arrived early, hoping to help with setup and catch the first football games. David was a social media enthusiast who documented every family gathering with live updates and behind-the-scenes videos. "Where's Annette?" David asked, pulling out his phone to start filming. "I wanted to get some cooking footage for my followers." "She's not here," Marcus said miserably. "What do you mean she's not here? Who's cooking dinner?" David captured the next few minutes on video, inadvertently documenting the moment Marcus realized he had no backup plan. 30 people were expecting a feast in 9 hours, and nobody had considered what would happen if I wasn't there to produce it. The video showed Marcus frantically calling catering companies, while Dorothy stood in the background, alternating between fury and desperate problem-solving. But it was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Every caterer was either closed or completely booked. David's video went immediately to the family group chat, where it exploded into a flurry of responses. Some family members expressed concern for my well-being. Others demanded explanations for the missing Thanksgiving dinner. Uncle Tom, Dorothy's own brother, watched the video twice before typing, "Maybe Dorothy finally pushed too hard." By 9 a.m., early arriving relatives were texting questions about arrival times and menu details. Marcus found himself explaining over and over that there had been a misunderstanding about the dinner arrangements. Sarah Marcus's ex-girlfriend arrived at 10 a.m. with her family in tow. She swept into the empty kitchen with the confidence of someone returning to familiar territory. "Don't worry," she announced. "I can take charge here. I remember how your family likes things prepared." But Sarah's confidence exceeded her actual abilities. She hadn't cooked a large meal in years, and her memory of family preferences came from college dinner parties, not formal holiday gatherings. Within an hour, she'd burned a trial batch of dinner rolls and discovered that the turkey she'd thrown into the oven was still frozen solid. Dorothy's attempts to maintain control only made things worse. She criticized Sarah's techniques while offering contradictory advice, creating confusion instead of solutions. The woman who'd spent 3 years documenting my inadequacies was now watching her preferred alternative fail spectacularly. More relatives continued arriving throughout the morning, each group bringing fresh questions about the missing feast. Dorothy tried maintaining her narrative that I'd suffered some sort of mental breakdown, but David's videos were undermining her story. "Annette looked pretty rational in that email," Cousin Maria observed after reading my message. "Detailed timeline-specific examples, logical conclusions. This doesn't sound like instability to me." Maria had always been friendly toward me, but I'd never realized she was paying attention to family dynamics. Now she was openly questioning Dorothy's version of events, and other relatives were listening. Uncle Tom, who'd watched Dorothy's behavior for 60 years, finally spoke up. "Dorothy, you set that girl up to fail. 30 people by herself. What did you think would happen?" "I was trying to help her develop proper skills," Dorothy protested, but her voice was losing its authority. "You were trying to prove a point," Tom replied. "Same thing your mother-in-law did to you 40 years ago. I remember those family dinners, Dorothy. You were miserable." The conversation I'd overheard began playing differently in people's minds. Dorothy's criticism of my housekeeping started sounding less like helpful observation and more like systematic undermining. Her documentation project seemed creepy rather than caring. By noon, the family group chat had split into factions. Some members supported Dorothy's position that I'd overreacted to normal family expectations, but a growing number were questioning whether those expectations had been reasonable in the first place. Marcus sat in his empty kitchen surrounded by relatives debating his marriage and began to understand what I'd been trying to tell him for 3 years. Without my labor holding everything together, the family dynamics he'd considered normal were revealed as unsustainable. Meanwhile, I was landing in Miami where Claire waited with mimosas and a genuine smile. For the first time in years, someone was happy to see me without expecting anything in return. Claire's beach house felt like stepping into a different world. White walls, comfortable furniture windows that actually opened to let in fresh air instead of being sealed shut to maintain perfect climate control. Most importantly, it felt peaceful in a way I'd forgotten homes could feel. "Tell me everything," Claire said, handing me a mimosa and settling into the couch beside me. I started with Dorothy's arrival 2 days ago and found myself talking for 2 straight hours. Claire listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned as the story progressed. "Annette," she said finally, "this isn't normal family stress. This is psychological abuse." "I know that now," I said, "but it happened so gradually. Each individual incident seemed manageable, like maybe I really was being too sensitive." Claire pulled out her phone and showed me a folder labeled with my name. Inside were screenshots of our text conversations and voicemails from the past 3 years. "I've been documenting this," she said. "Look at the progression." The early messages were typical sister communication, sharing funny stories and making plans. But gradually my messages became shorter, more anxious. I stopped sharing good news. My social media posts became infrequent, then stopped altogether. "You disappeared, Annette. Not physically, but emotionally. Every time we talked, you sounded smaller." Back home, the family intervention was continuing beyond Thanksgiving Day. Marcus's relatives had gathered in his living room ostensibly to figure out dinner arrangements, but the conversation kept returning to my email and the behaviors it described. Cousin Maria had appointed herself as my unofficial advocate, pulling up examples of Dorothy's criticism from family gatherings over the past 3 years. "Remember last Christmas when Dorothy corrected the way Annette folded napkins in front of everyone?" Maria said. "Or Easter when she announced that Annette's ham was acceptable for a first attempt, even though Annette had been cooking hams for years." Other relatives began sharing their own observations. Aunt Patricia mentioned that she'd tried calling me several times to arrange coffee dates, but Dorothy always intercepted the conversations, explaining that I was too busy with household management to socialize. "I thought Annette was just antisocial," Patricia admitted. "I didn't realize Dorothy was screening her communications." Uncle Tom produced his own evidence, 3 years of holiday photos, where I looked increasingly uncomfortable and isolated, while Dorothy commanded center stage. The visual progression was damning. "Look at her face in these pictures," Tom said. "That's not a happy woman. That's someone who's learned to make herself invisible." Marcus listened to these revelations with growing horror. He'd been present for every incident they described, but somehow he'd never seen the pattern. Each individual moment had seemed trivial, easily dismissed as his mother being particular or his wife being sensitive. Sarah, meanwhile, was discovering that managing a large family gathering was significantly more challenging than she'd remembered. Her attempts to recreate Dorothy's elaborate menu had resulted in a kitchen disaster that was becoming its own entertainment. "The turkey is still frozen," she announced at noon, having underestimated thawing time by approximately 48 hours. "And I think I put salt instead of sugar in the cranberry sauce." Dorothy watched her preferred candidate struggle with tasks I'd been handling competently for years. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Relatives began ordering pizza and Chinese takeout, turning what should have been Dorothy's showcase dinner into a casual potluck of delivery food. The carefully orchestrated family image she'd been protecting was crumbling in real time. But the real reckoning came when Marcus's boss called in the afternoon. Jake Morrison had seen David's social media posts and was curious about the family drama that was apparently preventing Marcus from answering work emails. "Everything okay, Marcus? The videos your cousin posted are pretty wild." Marcus realized that his personal life was now entertainment for colleagues and neighbors. The doorbell camera footage of him panicking in an empty kitchen had been shared beyond family circles, becoming a cautionary tale about household management and relationship dynamics. In Miami, I was having the opposite experience. Claire's friends were stopping by throughout the afternoon, bringing food and wanting to hear my story. These women, strangers to me an hour ago, were outraged on my behalf in ways my own family had never been. "You cooked for 30 people by yourself last year?" asked Jennifer, Claire's neighbor. "That's not hosting, that's catering. Professional caterers have entire teams for events that size." "And your husband just watched football while you worked," added Susan, a local teacher. "My ex tried that once." Emphasis on ex. Their validation felt like medicine after years of being told my reactions were inappropriate. These women understood that Marcus's behavior was unacceptable, that Dorothy's demands were unreasonable, that my escape was justified rather than dramatic. But the most important conversation happened when Claire and I talked privately that evening. "What do you want to happen next?" she asked. "Are you trying to save your marriage or end it?" "I honestly don't know," I admitted. "I love Marcus, or at least I love who he used to be, but I can't go back to being that anxious, diminished person Dorothy turned me into." "Then don't," Claire said simply. "Make Marcus choose between his mother's approval and his wife's well-being, but don't accept a compromise that leaves you partially miserable." That night, I slept better than I had in months. No timeline to follow tomorrow, no critical voices analyzing my performance, no husband dismissing my concerns as overdramatic. In the morning, I would start setting the terms for my return if I decided to return at all. But for now, I was content to be the confident, valued person I'd been before I learned to make myself small enough to fit into Dorothy's vision of acceptable. The reckoning had begun, and this time I wouldn't be the only one expected to change. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Claire's front door. Marcus stood on the porch at 9 a.m. looking haggard and desperate, holding a bouquet of flowers that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of his situation. "How did you find me?" I asked through the screen door. "Your credit card," he said. "The airline charge. Annette, please, we need to talk." Claire appeared beside me, arms crossed and expression stern. "She doesn't need to do anything, Marcus, but you're welcome to try explaining yourself." I let him in, but insisted Claire stay present for any conversation. 3 years of manipulation had taught me not to trust private confrontations where my version of events could be disputed later. Marcus looked around Claire's comfortable living room like he was seeing authentic relaxation for the first time. No perfectly arranged throw pillows, no coasters positioned at precise angles, just a lived-in space where people could exist comfortably. "The family thinks I'm a monster," he began. "Uncle Tom called me an enabler. Maria posted a whole Facebook essay about emotional abuse in families. Even my father said I should have protected you better." "You should have," I said simply. Marcus flinched at the directness of my response. In our old dynamic, I would have softened that statement, made it easier for him to accept. "I brought divorce papers," he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "My lawyer drew them up yesterday. If that's what you want, I won't fight it." Claire raised an eyebrow. "That's quite an escalation from flowers and apologies." "I don't want a divorce, Marcus," I said. "But I won't return to the marriage we had. That version of our relationship is over forever. He sat forward eagerly. What would it take? I'll do anything. I pulled out a list I'd written that morning. 3 days of clarity had helped me identify exactly what needed to change. Marriage counseling with a therapist who specializes in family manipulation, I read. Dorothy gets therapy for her control issues with documented progress reports, a public apology to your extended family acknowledging that you enabled abuse. You learn to cook and clean without supervision or praise, and we live separately from your mother permanently. Marcus's face went through several expressions as I read. Hope when he realized I was negotiating rather than leaving. Panic when he understood the scope of changes required. Finally, resignation. My mother will never agree to therapy, he said. Then your mother doesn't get access to me or any future grandchildren, I replied. This isn't a negotiation with Dorothy Marcus. These are the terms for our marriage to continue. Claire nodded approvingly. Boundaries aren't suggestions, Marcus. They're requirements. As if summoned by our conversation, Marcus's phone started ringing. Dorothy's contact photo filled the screen, and her voice carried clearly through the speaker when Marcus reluctantly answered. Where are you? Dorothy demanded. I need you to come home immediately. Sarah ruined the guest bathroom trying to clean it, and I can't reach Annette anywhere. Marcus looked at me questioningly. I shook my head and mouthed, speaker. Mom Annette's in Florida, Marcus said. She left because of how we treated her. That's ridiculous. I've been nothing but helpful. If she can't handle basic family responsibilities, that's a character flaw, not my fault. You documented her inadequacies like evidence in a court case, Marcus said, and I felt a flicker of hope hearing him defend me. You criticized everything she did and then expected her to be grateful. I was trying to help her improve, Dorothy protested. Someone had to set standards in that household. Whose household? I called out loudly. Because last I checked Marcus and I pay the mortgage. Silence on Dorothy's end, then a sharp intake of breath. Annette, where exactly are you? Somewhere I'm treated like a human being instead of unpaid help, I replied. This is preposterous. Marcus, you need to control your wife. No, Mom, Marcus said, and his voice was stronger than I'd heard it in years. I need to respect my wife. There's a difference. The call ended abruptly. Marcus stared at his phone like he couldn't believe he'd actually confronted his mother. How did that feel? Claire asked him. Terrifying, Marcus admitted, and necessary. Over the next 2 hours, we had the most honest conversation of our marriage. Marcus admitted that he'd been scared of his mother since childhood, that her approval felt essential to his sense of worth. He acknowledged that transferring that dynamic to our marriage had been unfair and damaging. I thought keeping peace with Mom was the same thing as protecting our family, he said. I didn't realize I was sacrificing you to maintain comfort. Your mother suffered through exactly what she put me through. I told him about the photos and letters I'd found. But instead of breaking the cycle, she decided to perpetuate it. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing this information. So she knew exactly how cruel she was being. She knew and she chose it anyway. That's the difference between someone who needs help and someone who enjoys control. Around noon, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his father. Your mother booked a flight to Miami. She'll be there this evening. Marcus and I stared at each other in mutual horror. Dorothy's unexpected arrival would force a confrontation neither of us was prepared for. She can't just show up here, Claire said firmly. This is my home and she's not welcome. But we all knew Dorothy well enough to understand that social conventions wouldn't stop her. She would find a way to insert herself into the situation to regain control through sheer persistence and public manipulation. Marcus made a decision that surprised me. I'll handle this, he said. I'll meet her at the airport and set boundaries before she gets here. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Standing up to your mother isn't exactly your strength." "It's time to develop new strengths," he replied. That evening, Marcus called from the Miami airport. "I told her she couldn't see you until she completed therapy and issued a genuine apology," he said. "She threatened to cut me off financially and socially. And I told her that was her choice to make. Our marriage matters more than her money or approval." For the first time in 3 years, I felt genuinely proud of my husband. The confrontation was far from over, but Marcus had finally chosen our partnership over his mother's comfort. "She's flying back to Minnesota tomorrow," he continued. "But she's not done fighting this. She'll try to turn the family against us." "Let her try," I said. "Some of your relatives have already seen through her act. The others will figure it out eventually." Change was hard work, I was learning. But it was also possible when people committed to growth over comfort. The question now was whether Marcus could sustain this new strength when Dorothy inevitably escalated her tactics. 6 months later, Marcus and I stood in our kitchen preparing Thanksgiving dinner together. The scene looked nothing like Dorothy's rigid timeline or elaborate menu requirements. We were cooking simple, comforting foods we actually enjoyed eating, and we were doing it as partners. "Can you check the rolls while I baste the turkey?" Marcus asked, wiping flour from his hands onto his apron. The sentence would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. Marcus had spent the past months learning basic cooking and cleaning skills initially with the enthusiasm of someone trying to save his marriage, but gradually with genuine pride in his developing competence. "Remember when you thought cooking was mysterious women's knowledge?" I teased, watching him adjust the oven temperature with practiced confidence. "Remember when you thought my mother's approval mattered more than your sanity?" he replied, and we both laughed at how absurd our old normal had been. Our guest list this year included only people we genuinely wanted to see: Claire and her family, 3 couples from our neighborhood, and surprisingly, Uncle Tom and Aunt Patricia. The total count was 12 people, a number that felt celebratory rather than overwhelming. Even more surprisingly, Dorothy would be joining us for dessert only. Not the entire day, not as hostess or supervisor, but as a guest invited for a specific portion of the celebration. The change hadn't come easily. Dorothy's initial response to Marcus's airport confrontation had been to launch a campaign to turn his extended family against me. She'd sent detailed emails to relatives describing my abandonment and mental instability, complete with theories about my sister's influence and my inability to handle adult responsibilities. But Dorothy had underestimated how effectively I documented her behavior patterns. When she accused me of being dramatic, I had screenshots of her criticism. When she claimed to be helpful, I had photos of her kitchen reorganization and copies of her impossible timelines. More importantly, other family members had their own stories. Patricia revealed that Dorothy had been discouraging social contact between me and extended family for years, always with plausible excuses about my busy schedule or antisocial tendencies. Maria shared examples of Dorothy's public criticism that relatives had witnessed but felt uncomfortable addressing. Uncle Tom, as Dorothy's older brother, had the most impact when he finally spoke directly to her about the pattern of behavior. "You're doing to Annette exactly what Eleanor did to you," he'd told her during a family phone call that included multiple relatives. "I watched you suffer through that woman's criticism for 20 years. Why would you inflict the same pain on someone else?" The comparison to Eleanor had shaken Dorothy in ways that my resistance couldn't. She'd spent decades defining herself in opposition to her cruel mother-in-law, and recognizing the parallel forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own behavior. The therapy requirement had been non-negotiable. Dorothy had initially refused, claiming that admitting to counseling would damage her social standing, but when Marcus held firm, she'd eventually found a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and control issues. Dr. Rebecca Chen helped Dorothy understand that her treatment of me wasn't protective family leadership, but trauma repetition. The criticism and impossible standards weren't quality control measures, but methods of maintaining superiority through others' diminishment. "I thought I was teaching you to be stronger," Dorothy had said during our first mediated conversation. "My mother-in-law's criticism eventually made me more capable." "No," Dr. Chen had corrected gently. "It made you more defensive. Strength comes from support and encouragement, not from surviving cruelty." Dorothy's progress wasn't linear. She still had moments of reverting to old patterns, particularly when she felt stressed or out of control. But therapy had given her tools for recognizing these impulses and choosing different responses. The public apology to extended family had been particularly challenging for Dorothy. Admitting fault publicly went against every instinct she'd developed for maintaining social position. But seeing the support I received from relatives when the truth came out helped her understand that vulnerability could sometimes strengthen relationships rather than weaken them. Marcus's transformation had been even more dramatic. Learning to cook and clean wasn't just about acquiring domestic skills. It was about understanding the labor that maintaining a household actually required. When he spent 2 hours preparing a simple dinner for 4 people, he began to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd expected me to handle alone. "I never realized how much work you were doing," he'd said after his first attempt at hosting his parents for dinner. "I thought food just appeared and kitchens cleaned themselves." Marriage counseling with Dr. Patricia Williams had helped us develop new communication patterns. Instead of Marcus dismissing my concerns as oversensitivity, we learned to examine the specific behaviors causing problems and brainstorm solutions together. Annette's emotional reactions are information, Dr. Williams had explained to Marcus. When someone consistently feels criticized or unsupported, that's data about the relationship dynamic, not evidence of their inadequacy. The separate living arrangement from Dorothy had been essential for our healing. We'd briefly considered moving to a different city entirely, but ultimately decided that running away wouldn't address the core issues. Instead, we'd established clear boundaries about Dorothy's access to our home and schedule. She was no longer allowed to enter our house without invitation. She couldn't reorganize our belongings or criticize our housekeeping. Most importantly, she couldn't speak about me to other family members without including me in the conversation. These boundaries had initially felt cruel to Marcus, who'd been raised to consider his mother's comfort above other priorities. But gradually, he'd begun to notice that their relationship improved when it wasn't based on his compliance with her demands. "We actually have more interesting conversations now," he'd observed after a successful coffee visit, where Dorothy had asked about his work projects instead of inspecting our baseboards. Claire had become an unexpected ally in Dorothy's transformation. As someone with professional experience in social work, she'd helped Dorothy understand the difference between supporting family members and controlling them. "You can care about Annette's well-being without managing her choices," Claire had explained during one of their phone conversations. "In fact, trust is a better foundation for relationships than supervision." Today's dinner felt like a celebration of how far we'd all come. Dorothy would arrive at 3 p.m. for dessert and coffee, staying for exactly 2 hours before returning to her own home. The time limit wasn't punishment, but structure that helped her resist the urge to take charge of situations that didn't belong to her. Marcus and I had spent the morning cooking together, sharing responsibilities and decision-making in ways that felt natural rather than negotiated. When the roles got slightly overdone, we laughed about it instead of assigning blame. When I couldn't find the carving knife in its new location, Marcus helped me search instead of criticizing my organizational system. Our guests began arriving at 1 p.m., bringing side dishes and wine, and the kind of relaxed energy that made hosting feel like pleasure rather than performance. Claire's children played with the neighbor kids while the adults shared cooking stories and family updates. "This feels like how holidays should be," Patricia said, watching Marcus and Tom debate the merits of different gravy techniques. Everyone contributing, nobody stressed actual conversation instead of just compliment competitions. When Dorothy arrived for dessert, she looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically diminished, but less commanding, more like someone visiting friends rather than conducting an inspection. "The table looks lovely," she said, and I waited for the criticism that usually followed such statements. Instead, she added, "You've always had a good eye for color coordination." It was a small comment, but it represented enormous progress from someone who'd previously found fault with my every decorative choice. We ate pie and talked about books, travel plans, and neighborhood news. Dorothy contributed to conversations without dominating them. When she began to offer unsolicited advice about my coffee brewing technique, she caught herself and turned the comment into a question instead. "Have you ever tried the French press method?" she asked. "I've been experimenting with different brewing styles lately." As Dorothy prepared to leave, she pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I owe you an apology that I can't fully express in mixed company," she said. "I recognize now that I was using you as a target for frustrations that had nothing to do with you." "Thank you for saying that," I replied, "and thank you for doing the work to change. I know therapy isn't easy." "It's harder than I expected," she admitted. "But isolation is harder than growth, I'm learning." After Dorothy left, Marcus and I cleaned up together while our remaining guests moved to the living room for games and conversation. The kitchen that had once felt like a battlefield now felt like the heart of our home. "I'm proud of us," Marcus said, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I loaded the dishwasher. 6 months ago, I didn't think this was possible. 6 months ago, I was ready to give up entirely, I admitted. I'm glad we chose the harder path instead. Later that evening, after our guests had gone home and Marcus was watching football with the volume low, I updated the blog I'd started about recognizing emotional manipulation in family relationships. The response had been overwhelming, with hundreds of women sharing their own stories of being criticized and controlled by family members who claimed to be helping them improve. "Today was a good day," I wrote in my latest post. "Change is possible when people commit to growth over comfort. It's not easy work, but it's worthwhile when the alternative is losing yourself to keep others comfortable." The blog had connected me with women around the country who were setting boundaries with controlling relatives, demanding respect from dismissive partners, and refusing to accept diminishment as the price of family peace. Some were just beginning to recognize the patterns I'd lived with for years. Others were further along in their journeys toward healthier relationships. My story had become a resource for women who needed permission to value themselves as much as they valued family harmony. Comments poured in from readers who'd been told they were too sensitive, too demanding, too dramatic for wanting basic consideration from people who claimed to love them. "Your Thanksgiving escape inspired me to finally address my own family issues," one woman wrote. "I'm not ready to book a plane ticket yet, but I'm ready to stop accepting unacceptable behavior." Marcus had become an unexpected advocate among his male friends and colleagues. When coworkers made jokes about wives being difficult or demanding, he found himself defending women's perspectives instead of joining the complaints. "My wife wasn't being difficult," he'd say. "She was asking for basic respect. I was just too comfortable with the status quo to recognize legitimate problems." His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes publicly had surprised people who knew him as Dorothy's compliant son. But growth often required admitting previous failures, and Marcus was learning to see honesty as strength rather than embarrassment. Christmas was approaching, and we were planning our first holiday season with healthy boundaries firmly established. Dorothy would join us for Christmas Eve dinner again, with specific time limits and clear expectations about her role as guest rather than supervisor. Claire and her family would spend Christmas Day with us, creating the kind of relaxed celebration I'd dreamed about during those years of walking on eggshells around Dorothy's elaborate requirements. "We're going to have a tradition where people bring whatever they want to eat," I told Marcus as we planned the menu. "No assigned dishes, no performance standards, just good food shared with people we love." "Revolutionary concept," he said with a grin. "Next, you'll suggest that hosts are allowed to enjoy their own parties." Change had rippled beyond our immediate family. Uncle Tom had started addressing other problematic dynamics within the extended family, using our situation as an example of how silence enables harmful behavior. Cousin Maria had ended her own relationship with a critical boyfriend, recognizing patterns she might have tolerated before witnessing my transformation. Even Sarah Marcus's ex-girlfriend had reached out to apologize for her role in the Thanksgiving disaster. She'd admitted that Dorothy had contacted her specifically to humiliate me, and she'd been too flattered by the attention to consider the cruelty involved. "I should have declined the invitation," she'd written in her email. "Creating problems in your marriage wasn't worth proving that I could handle Dorothy's menu." The ripple effects continued to surprise me. Dorothy's country club friends had distanced themselves, initially uncomfortable with the public nature of our family conflict. But several had privately reached out to share their own experiences with controlling behavior and family manipulation. "Reading about your situation helped me recognize my own patterns," one woman had confided. "I've been treating my daughter-in-law exactly the way my mother-in-law treated me. It's time to break that cycle." As I finished my blog post that evening, I reflected on how different this Thanksgiving had been from the disaster exactly 1 year ago. Instead of 18 hours of solitary labor followed by criticism and exhaustion, I'd spent the day cooking collaboratively, laughing with friends, and feeling genuinely grateful for the relationships in my life. The empty kitchen that had shocked 30 hungry relatives into recognizing family dysfunction had become the foundation for healthier dynamics built on respect rather than exploitation. Sometimes walking away really was the only way to save what mattered most. Breaking cycles of abuse required courage, but it created space for genuine love and respect to flourish. Personal boundaries didn't destroy relationships. They provided structure for authentic connections to develop. As Marcus turned off the television and we headed upstairs together, I felt deep satisfaction with the choices we'd made over the past year. Change was ongoing work rather than a completed project, but we were committed to growth rather than comfort, to partnership rather than hierarchy. The woman who'd stood in an airport at 4 a.m. choosing herself for the first time in years had discovered that respect was always worth fighting for. The marriage that had nearly ended in divorce had become stronger through the difficult process of facing truth and demanding change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I was grateful for the journey that had brought us to this place of peace, partnership, and genuine celebration. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between keeping peace and standing up for yourself? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is walk away from what's comfortable to create space for what's healthy. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more family revenge stories, and share it with someone who might need to hear that their feelings matter too. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that you deserve relationships built on respect rather than endurance. Here's to families that celebrate each other instead of competing with each other, and to the courage it takes to demand better when we deserve more.